It's been 15 long, gruesome years since James Wan and Leigh Whannell brought us their low-budget, saw-breaking original horror film that helped shift the entire genre into a pile of body parts on the floor. It spawned one of the most iconic horror film franchises of all time that generated twist after twist in film after film each Halloween, keeping the audience in a constant game of blood-soaked Guess Who. The problem, of course, by the time Saw 7 or Saw 3D hit cinemas in 2010, and only 6 years after the original film's release, not a lot of people were actually left playing the game. Now, most people could tell you that the film simply ended up becoming a cliche of themselves. Much like the increasing comical exploits in A Nightmare on Elm Street, they saw the de-evolution of Freddy Krueger from intimidating villain to a wisecracking buffoon with more cringy one-liners than a failing pickup artist.
How's this for a wet dream?
But what most people don't know is just how much Lionsgate actually set themselves up to fail over the years simply by not following the game's rules.
Game over.
I'm Tom from Screen On Point, and this is Saw, how the franchise didn't follow the rules. So for those that are unaware, the origins of how Saw came to be might be one of the best Hollywood success stories actually out there. James Wan and Leigh Whannell, two friends fresh out of film school in Australia, keen to make it in the film industry with inspiration from the success of micro-budget movie The Blair Witch Project and limited by their bank account, set out to make a film that for the most part contained two actors in one room, a film for their small budget that could be a success. Despite $30,000 in pocket to produce it themselves, it was clear that as the script developed outside of this one room, that they would need more funding. So to help create buzz for this script, the two decided to produce a short film off the back of one scene in the script that they thought would work well as a demo for the overall look and feel of the movie. This short, now titled Saw 0.5, along with the script itself, acted as a calling card that eventually landed on the desk of producers Greg Hoffman, Oren Coolers, and Mark Berg in Los Angeles, the only producers that were willing to risk keeping both Wan as the director and Whannell as an actor in the feature length, and ultimately a deal to make the film was met with a tiny shooting budget of only $700,000 and only 18 days to shoot it. The originality and vision presented by the Australian duo captivated an all-star cast of actors like Cary Elwes, Danny Glover and Monica Potter, amongst some other very well-known actors of the time. From the original short film to the eventual feature film, James Wan's stylistic vision held true, harnessing the juxtaposition of fast-paced, time-stretching tracking shots coated in green that highlight Danny Glover's narrative with the claustrophobic, slow-paced handheld shot in dull blue that followed Dr. Lawrence Gordon and Adam in the present. Though categorized as a horror film, James Wan actually expressed that he felt that the narrative of Saw ran more of a huge mystery like a whodunit. And when looking at the horror elements in Saw, the direction actually teased gore in most parts as opposed to straight up showing the audience. During the razor wire maze scene, in a handful of shots of Paul, the prominent shot is a long shot time lapse that actually, when played without sound, isn't particularly gruesome. Amanda, caught in the reverse bear trap, hacks through the stomach of another victim in medium and close-up shots before searching through some sausages. Detective Stephen Singh meets his end in a torso blood-filled medium shot. Zepp is put to sleep in a close-up shot of Adam, and I don't mean put to sleep like you would with a sick pet unless you're some kind of psycho who decides to batter old Rover to death with the lid of a toilet. That's a different story. And the infamous foot amputation scene. 3 seconds of the blade of the prop saw covered in blood pushed against Elwes's foot. All in all, in the 103-minute film, there's only actually a handful of seconds making up the film's score, which is actually more closely resembling a jet-fueled Hitchcock shower scene. Most of what the viewer actually sees is made up of a collection of reaction shots injected with a fast-paced, adrenaline-fueled soundtrack and visceral sound foleying, probably created from cutting some oranges or something. Ultimately, these were the moments that, despite being visually rare, audiences and critics just lingered on, changing the entire trajectory of the films themselves from this point on. Marketed and released on Halloween in 2004, audiences saw an ending that presented a lot of questions that after making an unbelievable $103 million worldwide from a $1.2 million budget could absolutely be monopolized in sequels. Interestingly though, instead of giving Leigh Whannell and James Wan adequate time to just draft up an organic new story from where they had left off, in the sidelines sat another film graduate waiting in the wings to make his Hollywood dreams come true. Darren Lynn Bousman, a film graduate of Full Sail University in Florida, had moved to LA in the hopes of getting his script, The Desperate, a film described by Bousman as a claustrophobic bloodbath set inside a house where people were killing each other off one by one, made into a feature-length film. In April of 2003, after spending 2 years on the Hollywood grind, his father from Kansas, who had been sending him money, sent him a letter to say that the cash flow was going to be cut in 1 year's time. The reality check kicked Bousman into gear, and in a final attempt to sell his script with no agent, with no managers, he made up a fake agency as well as a fake management company to get a foot in the door. In March of the following year, closing in on his father's deadline, Bousman woke up to a phone call from Greg Hoffman, one of the producers of Saw, and was brought into Twisted Pictures, shown the film just as it was trending to be a massive hit, and along with Oren Coolez and Mark Berg, the four men decided that The Desperate was going to be developed into Saw 2. Of course, with the obvious success that Twisted Pictures and its distribution partner Lionsgate were having with Saw, it seemed pretty unlikely that despite writing the foundations for Saw 2, that Bousman himself would be allowed to direct it, with little to no experience in the industry. Despite this, however, Bousman was given the directing reins, citing Peter Block, an executive from Lionsgate, bought into what I was selling, and 2 months later was on a plane to Toronto to film. In a blog post on his now archived website, Bousman wrote, "To put it in perspective, just weeks prior I was penniless, sleeping on couches and working as a tape room operator dubbing videotapes. Now I was on a plane to direct a real Hollywood movie." With help from Whannell to rewrite The Desperate, luckily when it came to directing, Bousman also had a very explicit style to work from, clutching onto the elements that James Wan had laid out for him, with original director of photography David A. Armstrong to guide him through. This time, however, unlike the all-star cast of the first film, surrounded by a fresh-faced feature-length ensemble cast, it was Donnie Wahlberg who was given the central role, an actor who had arguably throughout his career been living in his younger brother's Mark's shadow. You've gotta feel sorry for the guy who was somehow upstaged by Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. Unlike the original film that saw 2 characters given 7 hours to escape, Saw 2 hosted 8 potential victims to be with 2 hours to escape. Almost a straight swap. As for the gory elements, the few seconds had turned into a few minutes of footage, but the production process generally held true to the original. With an original idea at its core and a lot to measure up to, Saw 2 ultimately gathered mixed reviews, highlighted with Neil Smith from the BBC giving the film a 3 out of 5, saying, "This Maccabee follow-up to 2004's low-budget horror smash can't rival its predecessor's fiendish ingenuity, but it makes up for it with a deliciously devious plot and enough gory shocks for a dozen Halloweens." And with that said, and another $147 million in the bag worldwide, Twisted Pictures went into pre-production for Saw 3. Between this time, however, between Saw 2 and 3, Greg Hoffman, one of the producers, unexpectedly passed away from natural causes at the young age of 42. A former senior vice president of production at Disney, Hoffman was credited as the visionary behind the original film and of course Bousman's follow-up, with co-producer Oren Coolez saying he discovered this movie, brought it in and talked us into making it. He was the driving force behind it, with Oren himself and Mark Berg now taking the forefront of the producing wheel, and the budget of Saw 3 more than double from Saw 2 with $10 million to spend. The say of the series now mostly lay with the fans themselves, with Whannell himself saying,
"Turns out the audience really took hold of those traps. I mean, they took that 40 seconds of screen time and said, yes, this is what we want." And really it was the fans that told us how much they liked the traps.
It's no secret that overly catering to fan service isn't always the way to go, but with Whannell back in the writing chair and Darren Lynn Bousman back directing for nothing more than in tribute to the man who got them their break, Hoffman, Saw 3 was just littered with what the fans at the time wanted: the traps. Gore was increased tenfold and traps even became inescapable, transforming from simply being chained to a wall to all-out engineering genius. Further on from the decreasing star power, Angus McFadden was cast in the main role opposite Tobin Bell, who had mostly only appeared in television and TV movies, but hey, he was Blackbeard. Interestingly, while it gained a generally negative critical response, the fact that Whannell understood and handed exactly what the fans wanted and changed enough to give the film a new life, Saw 3 amongst audiences still remains as one of the best sequels. This, however, was the last film that Whannell would lend his hand to, as when asked about 3 more films after Saw 3, he said, "I don't know how involved I'll be in any such sequels. I don't know if I want to. It's starting to feel like I'm painting with the same brush." Instead, Saw 4 through 6 and its narrative progression and legacy was put up for grabs in a Hollywood pitch war, ultimately won by Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan, 2 men at that point that were only known for the low-budget 2005 comedy horror film Feast. Unlike Whannell and Bousman before them, Melton and Dunstan broke into the industry not from the overpowering support and belief from seasoned producers, but because of their convenience and salesmanship. On season 3 of Matt Damon and Ben Affleck's documentary series Project Greenlight, a show focusing on first-time filmmakers being given the chance to write and direct a feature film, Melton and Dunstan's script Feast was one of the final scripts to make it to the final selection process that saw Damon, Affleck and the master of horror himself, Wes Craven, keen to choose against it.
I don't see people going to see Feast.
They're saying, our script is funny, it's campy, and it's like, yeah, Evil Dead 2 is funny and campy. Your script's not that funny and campy.
You're like sitting 2 seats away from the master of horror who is telling you it sucks.
Ultimately, the studio Dimension Films overruled the Oscar-winning writers, and Feast was chosen as the feature they were going to make, mostly because it was the script that could be filmed with the smallest budget and therefore most likely turn a profit for them.
There is enthusiasm at Dimension to make and market Feast, to put the company behind it.
But it's like, do you believe in Feast because you can make it for a price and you can flip it for a bigger price? Or do you believe in Feast because you really think it's the best movie?
The film, however, was released to both mixed and negative reviews and only grossed $658,000 against the $3 million budget. It was, however, enough to get both Melton and Dunstan into the pitching room at Twisted Pictures, and after selling them Saw 4, 5 and 6 in 1 hour and a half sitting,
and then Saw 4, Saw 5, Saw 6, and it was like way too much information.
Shingled with ideas.
It was like an hour and a half presentation.
yeah, less time than it took the character from the first Saw to amputate his own leg with a blunt saw. Saw 4 was in pre-production with the contest winners at the helm. From the opening scene of Saw 4, it was obvious which direction Melton and Dunstan were taking the audience. They were moving away from the rare gore suspense-building mystery of the original to an all-out gory shock fest that was highlighted in the first 5 minutes with close-ups of an explicitly gruesome autopsy, with a new architectural narrative that helped Jigsaw continue his work past the grave via a detective character with a dark, suspicious stare, overtly named Hoffman in tribute to Greg that briefly appeared in Saw 3. The twists began to be more reminiscent of old age pedestrian right turns, and despite Whannell edging towards a more impactful ending that the audience could work out in the first 15 minutes of Saw 3 that saw an emotional plot in the father-daughter love story between Jigsaw and Amanda, Melton and Dunstan explicitly relied on the reputations of the twists in Saw 1 and specifically 2 to fuel their films. This time warp no one safe narrative played such a large role in attempting to keep the audience guessing that by the time that we got to Saw 6, after the damage that Saw 5 caused by alienating the fans, the film looked like a porn parody. Despite David A. Armstrong still on cinematography duties, the lighting was so outrageously explicit that it resembled something closer to an episode of WWE Raw quickly scrambled together for broadcast later in the night, rather than the blue and green hues that the first few films stayed true to. And the ever-expanding traps, well, they were now something that even MacGyver himself couldn't disarm. With Saw 6 pulling in the lowest box office results since the release of the original film, despite still making 6 times its profit, it's clear that Lionsgate began to panic as the Final Destination and My Bloody Valentine, 2 other horror films of the same year, had jumped into the 3D territory, delivering significantly higher box office results. With audiences getting bored of Saw, Melton, Armstrong and Lionsgate decided to load all the bases on a 3D version of their own.
And so all of a sudden what was intended to be a Saw 7, a Saw 8, and maybe even a 9 had to just be, all right, we're loading all the barrels and we're just going to fire this one last shot.
And the following year, Saw 3D was released, ironically titled Saw the Final Chapter. But was it really? So the question was, what could they possibly do to bring fans back to the cinema? The answer, take the game live to the public who, despite screaming their little heads off, still passively crowded around the madness, and bring back Dr. Lawrence Gordon and have him throw a saw straight at the audience, a moment in one shot that could be representative of almost every film that succeeded the first. A swift, thoughtless release aimed straight at the audience that ultimately missed and means nothing at all. Let's hope Chris Rock can shock it back to life. Thanks for watching that video. Please do like and subscribe. We upload 2 tasty and tenderized videos a week to sink your teeth into, and do let us know your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to follow us at Screen On Point and Tom A. Ransom on Twitter to satisfy my narcissistic need for acceptance and love, and you make sure you have a wonderful day.